This is the Convene podcast. My name is Maggie, digital media editor. Welcome all to another talk focused on Convening Leaders 2025. Barbara, what is today's topic?
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. Today we're going to talk about main stage speaker Kishore Mahbubani. And he is a Singaporean author and a former diplomat and statesman. And he's got just a fascinating background because he was born in Singapore, but his parents were from India, and they were part of the migration to Singapore following the partition of India into two states. And when he was born, Singapore was still a colony of the British Crown. And Mahbubani was raised in poverty, but he got a scholarship to the National University of Singapore, where he was a student activist and studied philosophy. And then he had a long career as a diplomat. And part of the time he was in the United States and he headed the UN Security Council. And now he is back at the National University of Singapore, where he is the head of the Asian Peace Program. And what I've just found very fascinating about talking to him is I consider myself to be well-read, and I realized how Western-centric my sphere of knowledge really is. Because just in talking with him, he really is talking about the major shifts in the relations between the West and the East, and how much the Asian economies have grown in the last 50 years. And I think that, speaking for myself, we can get so hyper-focused on different relationships between like the US and China and miss the bigger picture. So he is really going to bring the big picture about what's changing. So I just cannot wait to hear what he has to say, and also to hear what the reaction is by the participants at Convening Leaders, because I imagine that many of the US participants are probably a little bit like me, that really have a very narrow understanding of the global picture. Yeah, Maggie, what are you looking forward to, or what do you think?
I was also thinking how he would make a very good parallel between the US and Asia, because a lot of his books, and he has written 10 books, they seem to focus on this kind of relationship. But then I just saw a little bit of an interview he did in, I don't know if it's a podcast exactly, but it's called China Books Review. And they talked to him where he was speaking about one of his latest books, Living the Asian Century, an undiplomatic memoir. And there he also brings EU in this whole conversation, which was helpful also to me, because it was also very eye-opening. Like you said, I was thinking, oh my God, how I don't really know about these relationships, and there's so much to learn from him. So I really love that. And something that he says in this interview is that his book starts with the line, "Blame it all on the damn British." The person who interviews him is actually British. So it was a very fun start to the conversation, which is actually quite serious conversation. But he still makes the topics somehow accessible to the masses, which I think is really special and important. Michelle, what are you thinking?
I'm just going to follow up on what you just said from another article I read, where he said that he expresses disappointment that the European Union countries do not know how to be humble and often prefer to lecture Asian nations rather than collaborating with them. And he also talked in this article about how, or this interview about how Americans tend to think of Asia only as China, but that there are far more people in other Asian countries and a larger economy than just China. So we probably also could stand to be a little more humble. Certainly Americans who think that, the world revolves around our economy, and that when the U.S. sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. I am looking forward to learning more from him on this. Casey, how about you?
I am too, Michelle. When Barbara spoke with him, I thought it really was interesting. She asked what the biggest risks facing the world right now are. And I think for most of us who are not super familiar with these topics, we would say, oh, well, wars, of course, breaking out. And he did mention, of course, the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, but he named the biggest geopolitical issue as the contest of what's the number one power in the world. He doesn't see wars breaking out between these really large powers because that would lead to nuclear war. But he just sees these contests between different countries and how that can play out in really damaging ways for populations of both as being the real risk that we're seeing. So I just appreciate his kind of unique perspective on it. He also mentioned climate change, which is, of course, something we cover all the time in Convene. And that's a real challenge that we all kind of need to come together to face. Barbara?
Yeah, when I spoke with him, one of the things that impressed me about him was his optimism, given kind of the state of the world. And it'll be interesting to see if what he said then, if there's any difference now, because the world continues to change. One of the things that I really appreciated about him is that his message is not always well liked. He's really going into places of power and saying, you're really not as powerful as you think you are. And I think that that's really interesting. He's like somebody who's, I think the phrase is speak truth to power. And I think he'll have a corollary with former Representative Lynn Cheney, who also has a history of saying things that people don't really want to hear to very powerful people. And I think that's just something that I would love to be able to do with more confidence and clarity to speak up.
I'm so curious to hear what Liz Cheney has to say, just given the election results. And I feel like she's somebody who can be admired just for going against party lines to do what she thought was right in the best interest of democracy. I'm very interested to hear what she thinks about the election results, because from what I have heard on a very superficial level is that from the Democratic side was more about democracy, which is a very lofty kind of concept, whereas from Trump and his team, it was more about the economy, which people can definitely relate to because everybody goes to the grocery store and everybody who has a car fills up on gas. So those are the things that people really can relate to. Can they relate to this idea of what democracy is supposed to be? It's a little harder, and maybe that's something that they see as sort of a luxury, whereas they're just trying to put food on the table. So I'm really interested to hear what she has to say about, if she is going to talk about the election.
I see that Liz Cheney's session is going to be called Principled Leadership in a Polarized Society, which I think is very relevant here after what you were just saying. And it says how she wants to talk about how her leadership in her political career really relates to business events and how we can play a role in combating divide and fostering an exchange of ideas between people. And I feel, of course, there was a lot of divide leading up to the election, but I feel like that will probably continue to get worse instead of better. And so I think planners and leaders in this community really need to know what strategies she's had in a much more contentious environment than they're probably in, and how they can apply that to their own lives. Maggie?
Yeah, we're going to bring the conversation back to Mahbubani because Liz Cheney for me is a bit of more of a foreign topic. Well, they both are foreign to me. But what that also made me think of what you were saying about her and bringing back to Kishore is that, he is actually going to give a perspective on how to navigate geopolitical changes. And I feel that sounds like this huge topic that where do you put the event planner in that conversation? But what I really liked, and I took that away from Barbara's interview, is that he really sees events as, first of all, promoting inclusivity and really becoming these platforms to promote international cooperation and cultural exchange. And I feel that's very, very relevant to our audience and just seeing this perspective. So if he really manages to take this huge topic and narrow it down and make it relevant to our audience, I think it will be just perfect. Barbara?
Yeah, I was just nodding in agreement. I was thinking, we talked a little bit about how when the UN gets together, it's a little bit about a business event. Business events, people coming from all over and a shared platform. And there's usually not as much contention at business events, but it is a way for people to really understand one another and be introduced to new ways of thinking.
You interviewed Mahbubani before COP29, and I would love to hear his thoughts about COP29 because we've published, I'm going to say, at least 5 articles in News Junkie that are critical of COP29 and how it's become a lot of greenwashing and that you allow fossil fuel advocates to have a presence and that it's held in a country where fossil fuel reigns supreme. I'd love to hear what he thinks about that because he's in favor. He talks about how our industry has the capacity to bring people together, but I think that people are very disappointed in the way COP29 has played out and whether it actually allows us to make meaningful progress in climate change.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about how, I hope that he will talk about how change happens, like you said, because I think a lot of people they don't want to give up anything. They want to solve problems without giving anything up.
Mm.
And I think it'd be interesting to see if he talks about how that's navigated when there's clearly change that's not going to feel good, but you have to do it to get to the results that you want, as in climate change.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Even though I doubt he'll go into the comfort part of things.
Yeah.
But that's the core issue of our systemic problems many times, that we're so used to comfort. But this whole thing made me think of my conversation with Flo, our managing director of APAC. And we had a conversation that kicked off season 5 on business of events, the event she put together first in 2024. And she said that part of the idea of creating this event and what her hope was that many planners from other countries, other parts of the world would actually come to the business of events, or what she calls BOE, and then learn how to make business with people in Asia Pacific. Because she's like, yeah, it's different. You can read about it, but once you're submerged into that environment and you shake hands and you see how these people are, it's much more easy to do business with them and understand them. And that was how I kind of interpreted his message of events becoming platforms. Michelle?
I was just going to piggyback on what Barbara said about comfort and change. I think the way Paul Dickinson talked about it at Convene for Climate was that we have to convey the message that this is an opportunity rather than a sacrifice, and look at it as there's all of this opportunity to change the way we produce energy, and we need to go all in on that rather than, we're going to really have to suffer and sacrifice, because nobody's up for that. They're not willing to do that. But I think that's part of the challenge, right? Is to create that conversation and that messaging so that people don't feel that this is going to be a bad thing. It's actually, if we do it the right way, it's a really good thing.
Yes. And I think the discomfort is change, is not necessarily like things are going to be worse or you're going to like, shiver in the dark, but that you have to like open your mind to new ways of thinking and not just keep doing the same thing faster and faster.
Yeah, and the way he dresses it up as an opportunity, I think it makes it more palatable to people. Because exactly when you say, okay, you have to suffer for this change, it's we don't want to do that. But suffering for a good opportunity out there, a lot of people are raising their hands very easily. There'll be a lot of interesting conversations at Convening Leaders, and I hope people just make these connections and see application directly into their way of working and their events, and especially in this very, very dynamic world that we're living in with a lot of very big macro changes, and the macroeconomy is going ways that we can't influence. That we just live with that and have to figure it out. So hopefully he'll bring insights into navigating this in the new year, which I think is the perfect time. Thank you all for this conversation. As usual, you'll find all the links in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, do give us a 5-star review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. For more industry insights, visit pcma.org/convene. Stay inspired, keep inspiring, and until next time.